Okay, so hello everybody. I'm very pleased to have you here with us this afternoon, or whatever time of the day you're joining at. My name is Klara Rehm. I'm a recent volunteer with the UNESCO Futures Literacy team. I've been with them for about 3 months. I have a background in history, so futures literacy did not come naturally to me, but it's been a very, very long and steep learning curve. And I'm very excited to be joined by Loes Damhof and Sebastian today to discuss how to nurture futures literacy beyond a futures literacy lab, a question that I'm sure a lot of lab participants have asked themselves. So if you would like to introduce yourselves briefly.
Sure. Sebastian, do you mind if I go first?
Of course, go first.
Yeah. Hello, everybody. Good to see you, or at least to feel you in this Zoom room. My name is Loes Damhof. I'm a member of the UNESCO Chair at the Hanze University of Applied Sciences in the Netherlands. And this UNESCO Chair is in Futures Literacy with a focus on higher education and training and teaching the capability of Futures Literacy. And as I am a practitioner by heart and a teacher by heart, is that I like to practice what I preach. So this question is extremely relevant to me. And I've been doing this for about 6 years now. And yeah, there's a lot to tell, but yeah, let's keep it. I'll keep it short for now.
Hello, everyone. Also from my side, today greeting you from very cold and dark and windy, and I could go on forever, Berlin. I was just expressing my jealousy to Klara because I still see daylight in her background, but which we don't have much of these days. But yeah, my name is Sebastian and I am a futures literacy practitioner. I've been working with futures literacy for 4 years. I recently joined a startup here in Berlin called Ellery Studio, and we work a lot with future studies and foresight and participation methods, speculative futures. And yeah, I'm trying to establish the futures literacy component in this as well. So maybe we'll get to talk about that today a little bit, but the struggles I'm experiencing. So yeah, excited to see some to read some familiar names and also to meet some new people. Thank you very much to Klara for involving me in this.
Yeah, it's great to have you with us. So I think before we sort of get into the conversation, Loes, I'd very much like for you to give a very short definition of the term futures literacy and also of what a futures literacy lab is, just in case someone among the audience is not familiar with the concept.
Well, and I assume this has to be done in a few minutes. Well, that's actually kind of maybe the first struggle that we might encounter, because there's no really set in stone, super clear definition of what futures literacy is. If you navigate in this field a little bit, and especially if you're in this field a little bit longer, then you'll see that there are several definitions, there's maybe different understandings. But if we take the work of my teacher, Rian Miller, as a starting point, that I would say that future literacy is a capability, it's a skill, a competency that allows you to diversify and imagine multiple futures and use those futures to see the present anew. So to look differently at the present. And I'm saying we're using futures because we do this from an understanding that the future does not exist. And there is certainly not one future, there are multiple futures. So future literacy helps you expanding this notion of what the future is and futures, and to identify the biases and assumptions that are lying underneath all those different futures when we do that. And by doing that, we can not only use the future for either planning or preparing ourselves for certain scenarios, but also to become more open for the unexpected, the novelty, the emergence, uncertainty. And if you can navigate between those usages of the future, then you could say that you're on the road to becoming futures literate. And this capability is not something that it's kind of more of a mindset, I would say, maybe even a way of being, a way of thinking. That is not done overnight, and not in a workshop of a couple of hours, and certainly not in an hour and a half. So there's several tools to practice and engage with this capability. And one of them is a future literacy laboratory. And laboratory is an experiment. It's a workshop. It's a learning space. Could call an intervention, where it's very hands-on. It's a learning by doing experience. And in that laboratory, you play with different ways to use the future. We explore probable futures, desirable futures, and also explore alternative futures, what we call a reframe. And by looking at those three different kinds of futures, we can identify these assumptions, what I was talking about. And by doing that, new questions come up, and we are able to look at the present with a fresh pair of eyes, so to speak. So these laboratories are the workshop, the tools, and they can differ. I've done workshops in all kinds of forms and shapes, from very short, dense, to 5-day lab was, I think, my longest one. And it differs per target. It can be done for all kinds of target groups, different themes, different settings, different purposes. But there are also, of course, many tools and many ways to practice this capability, to apply it. But that's one. So often it is, sometimes we mix them. We say the lab is, when we talk about the lab, we talk about the workshop, the tool, the methodology. And if we talk about FL or future literacy, then we talk about the capability. So one is the tool to practice the capability. So maybe that's an important distinction to make. And in the larger field of future studies, future literacy takes a place. There are, of course, many ways to think about the future, to imagine multiple futures. I won't name them all, but I'm sure some of you have experience with different ways. Think of foresight, scenario planning, futuring, futures consciousness. There are many other ways. And future literacy, for me, really introduces this idea of, can you anticipate for emergence? We often anticipate for the future through planning or preparing, but can you also anticipate for emergence? And yes, and we can, and we need both. So to me, that is a different way of looking at how we use futures. I hope that's a little bit clear. And very important, we can talk about this for a long time. It's always best to experience it. That's the same time also a bit of the challenge. So if you are an opportunity to be part of a lab, I strongly encourage you to do so. Sebastian, did I forget anything? I forgot a lot, but you know.
I mean, I think the only thing that I might add is that this pragmatism of asking the question what it is, I would maybe reformulate it in a way of what is the range of futures literacy. And there's where I think the value in it lies, about what you said. Experiencing it in a lab makes you curious and makes you think about what futures literacy actually could be and what ranges it applies to.
Yeah.
So you've offered a very good definition of both futures literacy and the labs. But if we now think about, we're a participant, we've done the lab, it was potentially very much, mind expanding. We found it very interesting. And a few days later, we kind of find ourselves asking, okay, that was cool, but what do I do now? Like, how do I carry this forward? What do I do with this thing that happened, with this learning experience? Sebastian, do you have any thoughts on this? Because I know that you had a very similar experience.
Yeah, most definitely. I mean, to me, to first and foremost, the blueprint, I don't think there exists one in order to what to do after a lab. But once you experienced it, as I said before, it sparkles a certain curiosity. And to me, as a facilitator, as a moderator of a workshop, and when someone comes back to me and is like, I don't really know what I did there, but I kind of liked it, and I'm really curious to know more. And I think many of you have felt this feeling before and are curious to ask this question of what is FL. therefore, it's really important to embrace this complexity and the emergence that Loes has just talked about, because we try to find a pragmatic definition for FL, but then once we step out of a lab, we turn around and then we face this brick wall of inapplicability of futures literacy in the real world, because a lot of times, especially in a corporate and business context, where I also work in, it is just inapplicable, because we need to find quick solutions, quick fixes. We are talking about pragmatism all the time, and there's no room to explore. There's no room to just be ending up with a question in the end. So this brick wall is what a lot of people face, and then in the end it comes back to the decisions and the actions you make of, okay, how do I approach this brick wall? Do I try to climb over it? Do I burst through it? Or do I approach it and say, like, okay, I like futures literacy, I get back into my bubble when I do a lab once in a while, or do I really try to embrace it consciously?
Yeah, I as a person who works in a large educational institute, which has complicated systems to navigate around, I always, so I know I've experienced that as well. And I think I always compare it to, if the experience of a lab is like going on an expedition in the jungle, right? So you're gathering, you got a good team that you're exploring with, you got this inquisitive mindset, and from your facilitators you get a couple of tools to look around in the jungle, and then it is an incredible experience to do that. It feels free, it feels exciting, you're exploring unknown territory, it's wild. And then all of a sudden, after that, you come back into the world of concrete, and your expedition team is gone, but you still got, maybe the flashlight and the helmet and the rope, but you're walking in the world of concrete. So the challenge with that is, can you use those same tools that it looks like at first sight they're not made for concrete, but in concrete there are corners that maybe deserve a little bit of light as well, or maybe you can use a rope to climb over the high rise and see what is behind that. So I think with the tools that you acquire in a lab, it is possible to see what different uses can I use this. And because future literacy is about looking at the present anew, that is exactly what we're trying to practice. After a lab, at the end, it is not as much so much that participants, as I see it, are confused. It's just that it's difficult to see that new, see the present in a new light, or to see it anew when you go back into the world of planning and preparation, etc. So that's why we tend to, we as educators, we try to keep that openness just a little bit longer, to stay in that space. Hey, we've just been reframed, we just explore these different futures, this wildness, this curiosity. How can we, stretch that space a little bit longer? And it's hard because our world is often, really, attached or maybe even addicted to this idea of productivity and kind of a destination. Something needs to end. We need to have a product in the end. We need to do something at the end. But in this way, in any future literacy lab, since it is a potentially transformative learning space, things are already changing. You don't even have to do anything after a lab for you to feel the impact of the different insights, create new knowledge with fellow participants. Something is already changing and shifting. And sometimes it comes up, it's in a month later or a year later. And I think it's often our inability to be okay with that. Can we be okay with the fact that there's no clear product or clear goal at the end? Is it okay to trust that the change or something, the capability, is manifesting itself somewhere and will pop up at a later stage? So it's not just the challenge of the lab itself or the capability, it's also the fact that we're trying to make people see in the world that, or make people use tools for the jungle in a concrete world. So, and that is something that we have to explore and accept too. It's not impossible.
I remember in our preparation chat, Loes, that we both ended up referring to the concrete as the urban jungle in the end. So you find ways of using your tools and making your sometimes grey and drab and rather concrete environment a bit more amenable to your jungle tools. Sebastian, sorry, I think you were trying to say something as well.
No, I mean the discomfort that Loes has just talked about is of course very hard to capture in that if we talk about that urban jungle, because the discomfort is something natural. You feel it in the jungle. It's something really natural, and that's in my experience how it is in a lab, and what you try to, as a moderator, you try to convey that to all the participants. You try to convey to trust the discomfort and trust the uneasiness that you feel during a lab, and it might really contradict your thinking in a way, depending on the topic, of course. So it is only natural to take this back into the urban jungle and feel that it is not really applicable here. So the question also from my side is that how are we to maintain this discomfort, this feeling of discomfort, and trusting it in that urban jungle in front of that brick wall? I mean, that is a very hard thing to do. So my question, are we to do that? And then how are we to do that?
Yeah, I think that as a facilitator of labs, and there are some of you are facilitating here and designing labs as well, that's almost, I would say, courage. Also lies, that's also maybe a challenge for us as well. I think that it has to lie with us as well as facilitators and designers of these spaces. Is that to say, if people ask, okay, I want to do a lab, but then I want to have a product. So at the end, I just want to know, I love the openness, but at the end, I really want to know what the future looks like. Or this is great, but can I now have a scenario? And to say that to kind of stay away from that, there's a tension it's kind of trying to stay away from that, to go for the quick fix. Like, yes, let's use this lab as a tool to do more planning. That's not what this is about. And that is not easy to do that, and to stay and to try to keep that openness as a facilitator and a designer too. So after the lab, what's next? Sometimes I'd like to suggest participants to not do. Future literacy is often a balance to doing and not doing. And not doing does not mean doing nothing. It means not doing, but being, more alert and observe just for a little bit. What do I see now that I didn't see before? And experiment with a question in a meeting that you wouldn't ask otherwise, or trying to look around you and notice for yourself. There's something in there that I just haven't seen, even though I've been on the street many times. So I think there are very small nudges that you can use if you are willing to let go of this desire, this such a human, normal desire to have a solution, and to be productive, and to be efficient, and to have a clear end destination. And that is something that we need to nurture as well.
So how do we nurture it in everyday life?
Well, for me, and maybe it helps to talk about it from a personal perspective, because when I started on this journey, I wanted to study it. I wanted to facilitate these spaces, although I didn't really know what it was, and I just kept repeating design and facilitate the labs, and my colleague Alice is here too, so we were on the same journey. We were just doing labs. We didn't really know what it was, or if we were future literate, we just thought, let's just do these labs, and we just follow a script. And I remember one time asking a meeting with researchers on futures, and I asked everybody, do you consider yourself to be futures literate? And nobody knew the answer to that. And I thought, that's interesting. And then I asked, has any of you been in a lab, or have you experienced the impact? And then, no. And because that I knew, I didn't quite know what it was yet, but I had felt the impact that it had on me. And I couldn't put it into words, but I knew something has shifted in my brain, and that is incredibly powerful. So whatever it is, that I know it has impact. So for myself, I forced myself to challenge my assumptions on a daily basis, because I thought I need to know, I'd like to keep this feeling of being surprised and not being led by fear. If one scenario doesn't happen or one future does not happen, how do I respond to this? There's always another one. So how can I keep challenging my assumptions? And I think the best example that I have is when COVID happened. For me, that was a huge reframe, because I was so scared that I wouldn't be able to practice my craft, teaching in front of people, traveling. And I was so afraid I wouldn't be able to travel anymore that I just didn't see a path forward. I thought, I don't know how to put this into practice. And then I realized, what does this tell me about my assumptions about traveling? That somehow it has to do with mobility. But what if I let go of that assumption, but just throw it away and create a new one, thinking traveling is not about mobility, traveling is about exploration. And from that new assumption, I could see different paths emerge. And all of a sudden, I signed up for some incredible courses. I didn't leave my house for a year and a half. Well, I walked the dog, but So I didn't leave my house for a year and a half, but it was an incredibly adventurous year. Professionally, probably one of the most adventurous ones. And that really helped me to think, okay, so if I notice that fear, or I panic, or I worry, or I'm discomfort, all that it does, it's just challenging my assumptions about something that I was very attached to. So this is a personal experience, but so for me, then I thought about, let's look at ways to continue to do that. And I have more to say that, but I want to hear Sebastian's how he does that.
Well, I think if I want to talk about my personal experience, I will also relate this to Juliette's question in the chat here, because she talked about the similarity between futures literacy and circular economy thinking. Because to me, as with a background of political science, and very interested in this deconstructing of geopolitical issues and being, well, not only scratching the surface, but looking under the surface a little bit. Futures literacy is also, to me, a sort of key, or even a hammer to burst through that surface and ask more questions that I would not have come up with before, because it not only enabled me to think outside of the box, in my opinion, but it enabled me to throw the box away and think about something that I could not fathom before. And that's why I think, in that way, futures literacy is so interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary to use, that we are sometimes getting caught in that trap of trying to define it and trying to bring it only to one definition, and hereby related to one sole example. And that's why I think, and I'm also contradicting myself in this, futures literacy is both a blessing and a curse with that interdisciplinarity, because we can both bring it onto a certain topic and explore it in a very, very deep way, deconstruct, even in a post-structuralist way, bring things about that we did not see before. But of course, everybody knows there's no end to this, so it can always go that way, and therefore we can never arrive at that sole definition of it, because it is just a tool, and to me it's an add-on to bring about new ideas, new questions, new things to think about, and therefore also bring together certain disciplines.
Yeah, Sebastian, there's the question from Mercedes: do you think that FL is a never-ending journey? And that we discussed this a little bit, because you said you can never be futures literate. Yeah.
Yeah, that's also. I mean, you put me on the spot here because it's something I struggle with. I wouldn't say you can never be futures literate. I wouldn't say this, but I would say that I don't ever want to be futures literate, because this exploration that you have also just talked about with becoming aware of assumptions and looking in between those little cracks and things that we did not see before, is the skill itself. So this is something where you try to explore. Once you step out of that skill, you can reflect on what you did before. So be constantly being futures literate in a theoretical way is not very desirable, in my opinion. I don't know what all of you think about that.
Oh, but that's another thing. If it's not desirable, doesn't mean it's impossible. But I kind of agree. But at the same time, I also think we don't know enough about it to say whether you can be it or not. There needs to be a lot more research about what it is, the impact of it, how anticipation works, how our brain works. And I think, and that kind of responds a little bit to, I think it was Jason's question about focusing on competencies, vocational skills, right? It's easier to sell a competency, a skill, a capability. It just is, it's like, oh, okay, I get to learn and teach that, and I can acquire it. But if there's no end game, and what is the end station of being this having an end station, like, oh, now you reach level 5. What does that even mean of future literacy? Because because it implies a linear trajectory, and I don't think it is that. I think it's a constant loop, or it's a circular way of learning, because you're constantly inventing new features. You're constantly you're seeing new things, and that also counts for the capability itself. Just learning this and then you're done is kind of contradicting to the capability itself, as I see it. And so I agree with you that I don't like to be futures literate, but I like to learn more about it. So it's not something that if there's, I do like to think that there's a point to all of this. And then the point is that I feel more at ease, that with uncertainty, complexity, that's nice. I feel that, I like that. I also feel that I tend to act more from hope instead of fear. But does that mean that I'm there, wherever that is? I don't know. And that's very appealing to me too. So although calling it a skill and a capability is attractive for educational institutes, at the same time, you have to create openness and space to be able to practice it. And by doing it, and that's why it's so difficult to implement this in higher education, because by introducing this capability into institutions, you cannot but bounce against the institutional boundaries yourself. It just doesn't, it's not something you can confine in a set stage of parameters. So things have to move and shape, because you're questioning those institutions, you're questioning the boundaries, you're questioning the boundaries of time. You can question anything. And to have that space to be so open, you need to create space within the space where you organize it. And that's another challenge. So not only bring into the jungle or into the concrete, the urban jungle, but question that concrete itself. So yeah, I don't know. I'm just curious what others in this group think. So Jason is, and to respond to Jason, calling future literacy capability contradictory in itself, is there perhaps a better term that I can define? I'm sure there is, Jason. Maybe it's emergence. The word literacy can also be problematic in the sense that, yeah, that requires the capability, but what does it mean if you're illiterate? That's not good. Or so that's, and futures, well, it's actually maybe more about the present. So there's a lot of, with any word, any piece of language, there comes a set of limitations. That's just how language works. I mean, it's incredibly empowering. It gives us great space, and it is restrictive in itself, because language is just a way to capture something. So, so I think that I'm sure there's something better, and that's why we keep exploring. And at the same time, if we get stuck into a semantic discussion without discussing itself, then, you know, then are we really practicing it? So so that's also an issue.
I think that because I really like what Jason said, and to give you a very short answer, in my opinion, is that it would be present literacy, because a lot of times I think that when you really get into a deep conversation about futures literacy, you end up in the present, you end up in moments that you try to capture and that you try to explore through the assumptions you have. You end up with rethinking your actions and rethinking why you did things and on what basis you did things, on what foundation you did things. And that to me also relates that state that I just mentioned, where you are, I don't want to sound too esoteric or something, but this is the state you are in and you try to explore once you become aware, once you are futures literate. And to me, that stepping out of it, as Anna has said, the meditation and stepping out of it is very important. And here, becoming more aware through constant practice of futures literacy is a goal you can pursue, yes, but the practice of it is to know the difference between, as we are talking about here, Iremillet's framework, between those between that wonderful metaphor of walking on two legs. So being able to step out of it and trying to anticipate for the future, and at the same time anticipate for emergence, and most importantly know when you are doing one or the other.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Juliet says that subject matter expert. I think, Sebastian, we talked about this before, is about this idea of mastery or expertise, or I don't know if any of you know Bayo Akomolafe. He is I don't know how to describe him, thought leader, brilliant writer, poet, philosopher, activist, psychologist, recovering academic. And one time he was a guest on one of our training programs, and we asked him his connection. And he said, future literacy is about failure. It is, and becoming comfortable with failure, because you're constantly, every future you see in front of you, that's failing, right? It's constantly readjusting and seeing something different. And he put it in a really beautiful light, that to him, it wasn't about mastery or becoming better at something. It's constantly about failing another version or an assumption or a future that you saw. So for him it was about deconstructing narratives altogether, and just seeing failure for what it was, deconstruction and reconstruction. And so I don't know if that speaks to your comment, Juliet, but I kind of like that.
It's interesting because, I think we're all sort of demonstrating that we have a slightly different understanding of futures literacy. And I think that's part of the beauty of futures literacy in itself, and also the labs, is that it means so many things to different people, but also at different stages of life. So for me currently, what I find futures literacy the most helpful for, or what I've noticed over the past few months of being with UNESCO, is I am much less scared of making decisions. So I find myself having just finished my studies, and the future for me is very daunting, because everybody keeps asking me, so what do you want to do, and where do you want to go, and who do you want to be? And I have no idea. And every decision I made always felt like it had such a big impact, because, this was determining the path I was setting myself on. But it doesn't actually matter, because I can't decide, okay, if I take this decision now, there's an infinite amount of decisions that will open up at the next stage. So it's just about making a decision that feels right to me now, and accepting that that is a choice that I have made, and not to continue to question a choice once it is made. So for me currently, it's more about allowing myself the space to make decisions for myself, whereas for you guys, it's obviously very different.
I mean, I can relate to this, not only from a personal perspective, but also from a fact of what Loes has just talked about with BIOS concepts, or how he approaches failing in a way. Because once we dare to fail, as she just explained, once we dare to make decisions that might not take us where we essentially intended to go, or initially intended to go, we allow us to fail, because we know that that this decision will take us somewhere that we know, okay, we will end up somewhere desirable in the end, because we trust ourselves and all of those kind of things. But the way he talks about failing is that we fail to a point where we no longer are able to succeed, and success in a way our society defines success. So making that choice is basically saying you are in the eyes of society, you become a failure. But you try to be, if you want to call this futures literate, you are futures literate, but you give up so much that you cannot go back to a certain way of succeeding within our society. So that is a choice, I mean, that not many people would make, because we always try to, I assume that we always try to fail, assuming that eventually it will take us further than we actually wanted to go. So failing in a way that we never go anywhere is a very difficult choice to make for everyone, I guess.
Yeah. And bio also says that we're both fans of bio, but this idea, the idea of going forward, right? And he says, why go forward? Let's go awkward. Let's go deeper into the cracks instead of going forward or backwards. Let's go deeper. You know, I don't know where that is, but this notion of getting somewhere, that there's some end destination. And he talks about, let's stay in the middle for a little bit. Maybe that's, and I want to respond to Mercedes about her comment about navigation. I once read this article a few months back, was in the New York Times, about that people wanted to climb a mountain. You know, they were just trying in the Alps or in the Himalaya, and there some people, hikers, you know, not very experienced one, I assume, they would just type in Google Maps, using Google Maps to navigate to the top of the mountain. But Google Maps, of course, does not take into account weather changing, rocks, I mean, it just shows the shortest path. But that's not climbing a mountain. That's just rolling out, going from A to B. And that's how often that's one of the quick fixes that we're talking about. So like, hey, we want to climb this mountain, we will become successful. Let's turn off Google Maps, turn on Google Maps, and there we go. But that's not what life is about. And it's not about reaching the top of the mountain. It's about thinking about, why do I want to reach that top? Because I want to see the view. Okay. Why do you want to see the view? Because I enjoy nature. Okay. So what is it in the valley here, or down there, or around, or in that path, that you cannot enjoy about nature? So it's about challenging these assumptions of thinking, why do we want to go there? What is the purpose of it? It's a sense of achievement. And why is the top? Why does that represent achievement, and not going down the valley or walking around the mountain? So that's, the pressure just got a little higher. But hello, Riel Miller. Welcome. Good of you to join us. So that's where that's where the destination, the product, when productivity becomes the destination, is that what we're talking about? Is that's what we want to reach? But instead of asking, why is it, what are the underlying ideas of why we want to go there? And that's what we're trying to break open. But that's not always the easiest route, but very fulfilling and rewarding.
I also want to comment on Mercedes' message before we get into the others. The term flexibility really struck me, because what I just talked about with Bio's approach of failing to a point where you cannot go back to success anymore, defined within our society. It is the question of, are we able to be as flexible as to not embrace our goals anymore, to not reach our goals anymore? Are we able to do that? And that is my question to you as well. Is that being futures literate, to be as flexible, to not think about what happens anymore, and to not think about the essential goals that you assume in the future, but really be stuck in that present, to embrace the moment and embrace the assumptions behind your actions.
Yeah, and I cannot help but comment on the latest question in the chat from Juliet. I don't do it as much anymore, but I used to love rock climbing a lot. And there's another free solo climber, Alex Honnold, and he climbed El Capitan solo without a rope, any protection. Not because I thought, oh, why not? But because he practiced, he did not take any risk in his mind. He practiced every step along the way until an extent that he thought he had eliminated all uncertainty. So we thought, if I climb this without a rope, I feel 100% secure. I'm not afraid because I eliminated all uncertainty. And of course, there's still this risk with huge consequences, but that was his approach. And of course, that's often how we see in the future as well. If we prepare and plan, trying to eliminate all uncertainty, we have to create this false sense of security that somehow we can act from out of hope. But it's actually the opposite, I would say. Trying to eliminate uncertainty comes from more of a sense of fear. So it's not wrong, but it's not the only way to approach futures, obviously. So.
There's maybe
enough about the mountains.
Yeah, there's maybe to shift that perspective a bit from my side. I've not only because futures literacy, as you all know, has become such a big buzzword in many circles. It is also the fact that a lot of people have been disappointed when they actually get into it a little bit more. So what Juliet just said, so we are all actually practicing this. We are all aware of this. We are all doing this, but we are not aware yet. So in the end, people have been asking me as well. So this is it. This is the big futures literacy methodology. This is the big futures literacy lab that everybody's praising so much. So this is basically just that, and that. And then
already amazing that people say that. Is this I know. When I started, nobody knew. So that's a big shift already.
Yeah,
now it's vogue, unless people discover it's not. Yeah, but go ahead.
Yeah, but then to me it also goes back to that how applicable it is and how interdisciplinary it is. If you can really define it in a certain context and say, okay, this is it. Wow, I understood it, but I'm kind of disappointed. Still, it is also applicable in different contexts, and that's why it's so valuable to me. And this interdisciplinarity is both a blessing and a curse, depending on the target group that you approach futures literacy with.
So how would you guys say, what would you say makes a successful, if to go back to the word of success that we all say we don't like, but to use it again, how would you say you would assess a successful lab? Is it that participants come out saying they feel very inspired, or they really like futures literacy and they want to keep going with it? Or is it that you've set particular aims at the beginning? Because we've already discussed FLLs can serve many different purposes. What to you makes up a successful lab?
Maybe,
yeah.
Sure. Maybe should I start?
Yeah.
I have one example.
One good one.
Yeah, I'm not sure, but I consider, okay, there's an experience. I'll just tell you about it. I was planning on not to, but I will. So last week I introduced basically futures literacy to my superiors at my company, and it was really, I was anticipating it as something really big, and of course I wanted to do well, wanted to do a nice lab for them and everything. So time constraints came in and all of those things, and we had to end after the reframe phase. So a lot of you have experienced the lab and know that after this phase there might some confusion might come up in those participants. So I considered this afterwards, because I was in that little reflection round afterwards, I was bombarded with questions, and also with, is this really it, and all of those things. And I felt kind of I had to justify myself to make futures literacy legit, actually. And then to your question, what is the success of a lab? So many people who participated came back to me and said, you know what, I mean, I didn't understand this at first, but I'm really curious about it. It sparked my curiosity. So should we talk about that more, and should we explore that more? And maybe you explain, of course, they wanted to know the rest of the lab and all of those things. But what I want to say is that first, I considered this experience to be the worst lab I've ever given, even though it was very important to me. But then it turned out to be great, because this was something that really sparkled the interest, and especially ending after the reframe was something that I was, wow, okay, I did not want that, but it turned out to be great. So this is an experience I had.
Yeah, when I started doing this, I remember I was so excited when, you know, as a teacher, you're so excited. You see the students' shiny eyes and they're super inspired. They're so happy. And I remember talking to this with Riel, and I said, yeah, but they have shiny eyes. And Riel said, who cares? Can they imagine different futures? Do they understand how to use the future? And it's like, yeah, but they have shiny eyes. And so it was, so then I thought, I'm not sure if this is a good lab. What I did know, this was a very powerful experience together. Okay, great. That is incredibly valuable and potentially transformative in itself. Even if you don't really understand what you experience, if you come out of this and you felt something has shifted, that's great. But now when I look at it, because I've been doing this for a while, I look at it, hey, what are I look at the quality of their new questions, and I look at the quality of how they imagine futures and their imagination. And with the quality, I mean that are they in new questions? Did they actually see something new? Do they come up with new questions or ideas that they didn't have before? And has there something changed or shifted? And sometimes, so I look at it more now. And sometimes when it's the lab is organized around a really concrete question, and that question gets an answer or gets a certain direction, or there's an unexpected outcome, but something that's great too. But I've also come to understand that the biggest change and shift happens within people themselves. And as it's a curse and a blessing of being an educator, you'll probably never know about it. You just don't. Something happens and shifted and change. And after lab, people go out, do their, busy life, go back to their busy lives, and you just don't know. But something has shifted, and I have come to peace with that. And I think that if so in terms of the outcome, I come to peace with that. Most of the time, I'll never know, and that's okay. What I do know is that as a facilitator, I'm responsible for the quality of the lab. And quality of the lab requires a safe space, requires people to be able to share, negotiate knowledge and create new knowledge and talk about it. It requires a carefully designed, co-created design of the lab. So there are several ways that you can do to ensure that people take intellectual risks, and they come up with something, maybe beautiful, or for them it's really meaningful. That I think I'm facilitating. And whatever happens after that, I really do not want to become too attached to a certain outcome, because I think it goes back to the idea of productivity being the destination, and I just don't want to do that. So all I know is I facilitate these spaces. I do the best to my ability. I fully believe in this capability because it has changed my life. And that's all you can do, is invite people to go on that journey with you. And after a lab, to nurture that capability, it's important to keep that community alive, I think, because as all, we've been on expeditions, jungle expeditions, where are opportunities to talk about these things? Where are opportunities to start the dialogues and to learn from each other? It's in itself a collective intelligence knowledge creation process. And after the lab, that journey needs to continue. So it's a complex learning journey. Everybody enters it from different spaces. And I think that's also the beauty of it. So yeah, that's what I think. And I have many examples of many, many labs. I just did 3 in the last 2 days. They were all very good.
This gave me a small idea, because I think in terms of the target group and the participants you are eyeing to do the lab for, they often think in those patterns where they're like, okay, I need these concrete answers to a certain question. I will talk about the future of mobility. I will talk about the future of work, etc., etc. And then I expect a concrete answer in the end. But with futures literacy is, I think, as a practitioner, what's most important to me is that concreteness doesn't come in the end, but it comes in the preparation and the design. What Loes has just mentioned, we carefully design those labs based on the target groups and on the people you want to facilitate, and you think about certain opportunities, of course, but you try to keep that open space. And then sometimes it may seem in a lab that those things are unplanned, and this discomfort is really is not really desirable, and we don't know where we're going with this. But the careful design and the concreteness of the actual pragmatism happens in the beginning and before the lab, and in the actual design process, rather than in the end or in the outcome.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I think in that sense, I can say I've definitely experienced successful and very not successful labs. And it is uncomfortable.
Yeah.
Sebastian, you and I, we spoke about this last week as well, the sort of the multiple purposes that FLLs can therefore serve. And I know that we spoke about it as, it can potentially be a team building exercise, as well as many other things, because people speak very openly with each other. It can facilitate dialogues. Our last webinar series was on the role of futures literacy labs in peace building, which, is a completely different avenue to go down. Do you guys have any more examples or thoughts on, the synergies that can be created within a lab?
I think that Loes and Alice and many people here who have experienced futures literacy training as well can relate to this. That even in the digital space that we are in for a while now, is it can be very tightening, and it can be very familiarized, this space, through this futures literacy experience, because you're trying to, as Loes has already said, individually think about yourself and rethink your own character in a way, even though you might only think about a certain topic of a futures literacy lab. So in that way, it has the power to, and I cannot say this correctly because I still haven't explored it myself, but it has the power to bring together certain groups and create a certain familiarity with each other, across cultures and all of those things that I have never experienced in a format before. And explaining this, I think, would exceed my expertise, but still I know that it's there. I know that I connect with all those people I have either trained or did a training with, and that is why this capability in itself is so valuable to me.
Yeah. I've seen that too, that people, CEOs with students together, and because you're exploring futures far away, it's nobody's an expert of that time. Nobody's an expert on 2070, right? So that expertise is kind of left at the door, and students have or young people, just a valuable image of the future than the CEO does, of an expert. So in that sense, it builds bridges. But one of the things that I find that I encounter sometimes when people ask me is that, but with marginalized groups who maybe have one or two futures that they literally are in such dire circumstances, how does that work? How do you go to small Pakistani villages? That was literally asked me one time by a Pakistani university, provost of university. But also how refugee camps, how does that work? This seems like a very almost privileged, highly educated workshop to think about futures. I mean, what an incredible luxury to be able to do that. And I think that in that sense, and that's often how it is practiced, especially in those institutions. But I think I always like to go back to the notion that everybody uses the future. Everybody, you say all living organisms use the future, but everybody uses the future, and we can all become aware of how and why we do it. Whether it's very short-term oriented or maybe to some it seems limited, but still, I hope I can share this as once, thanks to in cooperation with UNESCO, we did once, was a result of a lab on the future of the returns to Syria, Riel, I think it was called. And then I was involved in this project, this few families who just wanted to rethink family hierarchy, family structures, power structures within Syrian refugee families after they would, if they would go back to Syria. And that was a very, almost an intimate setting to think about these things, but it was still possible. We used futures for them to rethink their family power structures. We didn't talk about, so what do you know, we used the different perspectives from the parents. They slept in the bedrooms of their children. And then the next day they would talk about the future from their perspective and vice versa. And that was not to plan a new future or to push them to become more creative. It's just about, hey, if we use futures which seem so far away and therefore maybe feels more safe, I don't know, but it feels like, okay, it's far and it's in the future. Let's use that to rethink certain structures and again to see the present differently. And I think you can do that in all kinds of contexts. And so I really think this notion that it only belongs to a certain group of people in a certain context, I disagree. I think it can be done anywhere, but it's crucial wherever you do this. It's crucial that it's contextualized and it's in co-creation with whoever has a question and or whoever is wants to rethink the present. So that I've come to fully embrace. And I'm not always in these situations. I'm in this really, Northern European higher educational context, but we also do a lot of work in other parts of the world. So the co-creation of the design and contextualization is incredibly important. And then, everybody uses the future and we can all become better at it.
I think the project that you were talking about with the Syrian refugee families, I did some work on the project report. And I think that's when I first really understood how futures literacy can lead us to come to terms with our present as well. Because what I found extraordinarily striking was that at the end, all the families seemed to come to terms with the description of refugee. So in the beginning, they kind of, they rejected the notion of being called a refugee or referring to themselves as refugees, whereas by the end of the lab, they'd all accepted that they were in fact refugees and that they probably did not want to return to their homeland. And that opened up an entirely new dynamic and an acceptance around the choices that they were each making for themselves, which I thought was just so fascinating. And it really drove home this point of rethinking the present because of how we approach the future in a different way and accepting the uncertainty of the future. Sorry, I just wanted to draw attention to one question in the chat, which I think is really important. And it's Jenny Matthews-Thuso who asks that it is very difficult to build virtual bridges. So when we're conducting labs virtually, how do we facilitate this process? Because I asked myself the same question.
Sebastian,
I think as a
recode,
I think I would rather pass that question to you because you do have more experience in that universal context.
I have a lot of, I've tried, I've done virtual co-teaching for a long time, even before the pandemic and before even Zoom was on the stock market. I don't even know what it is now, but and I always facilitated 2 classes, one in the United States and one at Hanze, and we would co-teach and they would meet up. And so what I know is that to build a bridge, a virtual bridge, you meet each other and you think it's a neutral space. Zoom, it isn't. We're all sitting in our own context, and from that context we bring our own values and perspectives and convictions, and we bring it to that space. So that's something to recognize first, that this is not neutral. We're meeting each other, but everybody brings their own. And because we're not physically, we didn't actually go anywhere physically, it's harder to recognize the other in their context. So that's important to always, I think it's always important to maybe introduce some kind of physical element to it, or acknowledge that we can't see most of the screens, and that's fine. But I always really like it if I see a background, because it helps me consider the fact that there's an other in his or her own context. So in the training in a lab, if people, and that's for some reason that's just not possible, but to add some some element to it, that we know whether it's write down a smell, what does it smell like where you are, any sound, or just an recognition. And I think when technology fails, so when you get disconnected, it's really important to understand that you're still connected. So the connection goes beyond the technology. I always embrace that fact as well. And that connection is really based on trust, from my perspective, that you trust in each other's commitment, and you trust in each other's intention. So those are all really principles that I have come to embrace when I meet people in a Zoom room. And there is, a good check-in, make sure that everybody's here, a good check-out, make sure you're closing the room, because the space between office and home is so blurry that it's important to show up and be present, and then leave and go to another place. The rituals, I find, are more important in these spaces. Have some screen off time, have some time to write down things for yourself, vary in activities, and just stay calm. I used to freak out when something technical hiccups, but as my colleague Alice knows, that I've become really good in staying calm. Be inviting. There's several techniques, but I think the core principles are this: acknowledge the fact this is not a neutral space, and we're all creating space to be present and to leave, and have that downtime now and then in between. I think it's very important. There's a lot to say about this.
Maybe if I can add one more thing. You just gave me an idea while thinking about it. Thank you. I had the time. It was a little bit about the intimacy you have to create in those kind of workshops. So I've heard many people say nowadays that they don't count their work in hours anymore, but in meetings. So it's like, okay, I have 5 meetings and then I can go home. So and all of those meetings are about efficiency and not having a bit of small talk in the beginning, of course, but then being efficient, getting to the point and coming up with a solution, coming up with a certain outcome. And that is what we often lose in those Zoom meetings, in my opinion. And from the trainings we gave at the Hanze, I really appreciated always that we took the time to capture those intimate moments, to bring together small groups of people and let them talk, let them get to know each other, let them just not come up with a certain solution to a very elaborate question or anything like that, but let them talk to each other, and then try to come out of that space, come back to the surface and see what happens. And I know that people like Abril here in this call has experienced this as well, getting up at 2 a.m. in Mexico City time for Futures Literacy training. So this is already something you have to capture in an intimate conversation with a partner.
But I gotta say, we've been doing these labs for so long, and then COVID hit, and then we were thinking, wow, can we do this online? I'm sure, your UNESCO team thought, is this doable online? Well, let's see. We're just going to play with it. In the beginning, it was all very, we know Mural, Miro, and all kind of cool stuff. But and then I just always, and then it's really easy to get distracted by the technical assets of it, because at the end, it's always about the quality of the conversation that you're having, about the space that you share together. So I never let technology paralyze me. Just it's supposed to be supportive. So I think, and now we've been doing all of us at UNESCO and us and Sebastian and I, we've been doing labs online, and it's like, yeah. And now I actually know people that have learned to do labs online, and then they called me and they said, I have to do a real one in real life. Does that even work? I'm like, yeah. I said, but how do you put thingies on an iceberg? I said, well, you print out an iceberg, you put it on a wall, and you put sticky notes on it. Amazing. so it's just interesting how these things have shifted. And I don't know how familiar everybody is with labs, but Sebastian and I experienced one time, played around a little bit with the reframes, because in the breakout rooms you don't see each other. So one time we used a reframe that we gave one group text and the other one audio, another one images of the same story. And we thought, let's just, play around a little bit. So there are several other ways to use this. Ultimately, you just want to diversify and imagine several futures. So, and there's through this, that's also possible to do that. I mean, I still like the physical ones, don't get me wrong, but yeah, it's not as bad.
So you've both experienced futures literacy in the context of higher education as well. I think just as my last question, and then I'd like to open up the floor to the audience as well to ask some last pressing questions. What do you think is the benefit of implementing futures literacy in higher education? And how does that compare to having a normal lab? Like, is it even worth having a normal lab if you could have the 2-year course? What are your thoughts on it? Because I know that obviously, Loes, you're very passionate about it, and Sebastian, you experienced Loes's teaching, so it would be really great to have your perspective on that as well.
Maybe I can begin, and then you can go ahead. I think at first, when I was exposed to futures literacy and my curiosity grew and all of that, I could only say, okay, futures literacy, the earlier the better. So not higher education, but high school and even whatever,
Get
kindergarten.
them when they're young.
Yeah, exactly. But now I'm not so sure anymore, because I do think there's a certain experience involved in experiencing a lab and trying to look behind the surface. And in higher education, I think it is certainly always, and Loes can comment much more on this, it is certainly always about people having to do something. So a lot of labs we've had and I've had is a lot about with students that have to sit there and are normally exposed to a lecture and something to listen to, and then maybe take a few notes and then go home and think about that later. But in a lab, that's why I like it so much, you can be a little bit introverted, and you're not the center of attention, because it's always about the participants. You're not, as a moderator or facilitator, you're not the center of this. You're not a teacher, you're not a lecturer, but you are somebody who guides participants in a certain way and goes with the flow, sort of. And that's why I think I'm not sure where to start with Rafael, but I do think that there's a big difference with people in higher education, people having to do it, people doing it in a corporate context. That's a whole different story. And that's why you have to be aware in the design process and the concreteness with which you come up with a topic and select a target group.
Yeah, it's a topic that obviously our chair is about. So we are trying in the beginning, when I embarked on this journey and almost immediately got joined by my brilliant team members. We thought, oh, this is a capability that all the master students need to learn. Because our master programs are around transition. So it was just one of our executive board members said, oh, this is an important skill. We're like, yeah. And we thought, okay, let's all give them go do them on a training or a lab, and then cool. Yeah. And then we realized, yeah, that's a moment in time that might be too short and we can't duplicate ourselves. So there are a lot of master students. There are even more students in general. So then we figured out that this we need to implement it in the curriculum. So throughout the whole curriculum, people need to use this capability. That's not that easy either. to integrate something in as a different way of thinking. Like I said before, it's impossible not to stretch the boundaries on the institution itself. It's impossible to do this within such a planned organization that is all about preparing students for a future, that's based on assumption. So that was really difficult as well. And now I think we're approaching it as a holistic. We have more of a holistic approach, in the sense that we still give workshops and do labs and etc. for students, and we're educating faculty so they become futures literate, if that's possible, and then implementing it, using it with the students, and we're using it for as a strategy for university policy. So if the university wants to make a decision or come up with new quality criteria, they're using FL labs now to gather insights of what people actually think about what quality is, which is great, because that means that they're using it as well in their decision-making processes. And I think that's a more of a holistic approach that I like. And at the same time, in order to continue to develop that, we also need research. We need to know more about what it is. And that goes hand in hand. So we also need more programs, more theses, more research groups, questions in combination with other topics. But I think that's what I think. It takes more time. It's easier to develop one program that everybody goes to, but somehow that does feel more. If we only put it in one package and implement it in an existing system, somehow for me that's not enough. I think it's a necessary capability for people to engage with, and on all levels of the university. So in order to create that openness for teachers and students to continue to experiment, to pilot, to try something out, you need that space for emergence. It's not enough to do this in one set program. That needs to have, because the impact of that needs to go somewhere too. So that's I think that's not an easy strategy, but I think it's the one that's most true.
I think the comment in the chat also kind of ties into what Sebastian raised during our conversations. Futures literacy at all ages and all education levels are an inclusive facet of critical thinking skills development. And I think, Sebastian, that ties into your question of, is futures literacy a skill that can be taught, or is it something that we have to learn for ourselves? So I thought that was a nice insight.
I agree.
Sorry, go ahead.
I agree, because there's a certain weight that is always applied on or put on the shoulders of futures literacy practitioners, if I may say this, if in a certain context, when people try to define it, to go back to the question from the beginning, what is it? And you don't get a straight answer, because there is none. Apart from those bus sentences, there's no straight answer, and then people are unsatisfied with that, and that brings about a certain discomfort with FL itself, and what Loes has just talked about, this room for emergence, which you need, is something that is then not there anymore, especially in a context where you are working with corporates that need outcomes, that need pragmatic solutions, that need really those kind of ways in which FL can be, in my opinion, an add-on, and then can deliver better answers or more answers in the future. But it is certainly not something you approach someone with in the beginning and say you will have this outcome, or you will have scenario X with which you can do X.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that Klara, you and I talked about this too, that about going back to like the whether it's whether you can be taught, because that almost implies it can be measured, and there's a test, an assessment, and then if you're multiple choice, and then you come in the beginning when we try to capture the impact of a lab, It was part of a PhD program, and we came up with a survey that was based on psychological tests. And there's some future literacy element to creativity, empathy, and futures thinking. And there was we got a lot of data from that. But in the meantime, we also felt that this is not capturing we don't know what we're looking for, but somehow this is not capturing. Also because the psychological test, does the person become more creative after the lab because of the lab, or the person was open to begin with and creative to begin with? And what are we actually measuring? And we did see that throughout all that data, that we couldn't, because there were so many different labs. What we did see was that people who tend to be more where the creativity would rise, they would also have a less personal need for structure, and vice versa. People who had more personal need for structure also became less creative. So that's the only thing that we could see over all that data that kind of was related. And now we feel that to capture or to leave that to almost maybe captivate that openness of that bewilderment after a lab, maybe it's just better to use other ways of talking about it. And maybe it's just better to keep that space a little bit more open, just a little bit longer, and then see whatever emerges, instead of sending out surveys with 40 questions. But maybe it's my discomfort with long surveys that is popping up. That could be too. Yeah.
No, I think that makes a lot of sense, because it is, it's so elusive, and it'll probably be more present at, different stages in our lives, different times of the day. But as Sebastian said, then until the next lab, when you are reintroduced to everything again.
Yeah, and that's but at the same time, again, if we continue to think like that, it's just another lab, when can I do another lab? Like the lab is the only place where you can practice this kind of thinking. It isn't, right? Because something is after each lab, there's always something has shifted. It just is. Even if the worst labs, what we think are the worst labs, whatever that means, something has happened that wasn't there before. It just does. Everything is always changing, and so do things during the process of a lab. And I think you also have to trust that change, that's something that has shifted, is traveling to other places as well. And sometimes it's not, we can plan another lab, but I think sometimes we just maybe need to be more alert and observant to notice the changes that are already happening around us, I think. But yeah, so don't fall for this idea. I've done a lab, now I'm back in the world of concrete, and I'm just going to put my tools on the attic. They're going to get dusty and rusty until there's another lab, and then I can practice them again. I don't think that's true.
Don't put too much weight on the shoulders of FL. That's my opinion.
Yeah.
Don't crush a flower that has just popped up. It's still developing. It's still growing, and we shouldn't crush it yet by trying to define it.
Yeah, I agree.
Thank you so much for that beautiful analogy. Are there any last minute questions from the audience that people would like to raise? And please feel free to unmute also and to ask them personally if you don't want to use that. We'd love to hear from you.
I'd like to make some comments based on some of the things that I put into the chat. I think the idea of a futures lab that invites different age groups from very young, even at the kindergarten level, to imagine futures is to invite everyone at every age in very specific spaces that can be curated by educators or by community groups. Proposing the idea of a lab allows people then to feel free about imagining novel scenarios and feel like they're included in that space to create world futures or world scenarios that are beneficial for them and are also, arising out of contextually specific and meaningful, details that would allow them to then develop them in other real world scenarios. So also, I really strongly believe that children, youth, people in higher education spheres, or the community in general, could benefit from thinking of futures creation or imagining as spaces in which they can contribute in meaningful ways, because I think that there are many people out there who derive a need to contribute to progressive world ideas, as well as feel this sense of inclusion in terms of moving the needle forward of our shared or collective human experiences. And so if the United Nations decides to propose a lab for futures thinking, I think that could only derive positive benefits for our, the denizens of our planet. So many positive things can occur, and it'll also allow people to then start looking around at platforms that offer free and Creative Commons tools, like the Futures Today Institute. They offer all sorts of tools, as well as reports, as well as different ways of conceptualizing futures based on technology, basing on shifts in our world systems of governance, and in many other spheres of knowledge, as well as lived experience. So I think that the proposal of a futures lab is a good thing, and it would show a progressive attitude towards looking ahead as a human species on this planet.
Thank you. Not sure. I think that's thank you for your comments.
Yes, thank you for your insight. I think one thing I might add to this is something that very pragmatic in a way. I know we're almost out of time, but Loes and also Klara has talked about this before, the applicability of futures literacy and taking the expertise away by talking about the future. So in that sense, there is the opportunity to sit a child in a room with an expert on a certain topic and talk about the future, because there's no expertise when talking about it, as we all know.
Mm-hmm.
So this is what you have just said. It reminds me of the beautiful thing of the applicability of it, and bringing together this non-expertise that is just something that really strikes me about it.
Children and youth are already involving themselves in concerns that perhaps we haven't heard their voices. I mean, the school strike itself was an eye-opener for many adults, and to encourage young people to think and to feel like they are co-creating along with adults their future, which in every sense is going to be about them, as the years pass, more than the adults who currently are directing them. You're encouraging ownership taking and encouraging critical thinking skills and alternate models of governance that are more inclusive and provide more equity for everyone in this world. So if it means that people then start thinking, young people start thinking around how to enable equitable distribution of resources and access to these around the world, then why not tap into everyone's thought processes? We can only stand to benefit.
I think that's a really beautiful note to end on. I don't know if you disagree. It's a very good.
Plus, I thank you so much. I'm not sure if I'm a little bit anxious to.
Paula.
Paula, thank you. Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Paula.
Yeah, because I need to go because I need to teach. Not
You need to
futures
do your
literacy
job.
this time. Yeah, yeah. So thank you
Anyway.
everybody for being here. Yeah, sorry.
Thank you so
Lisa.
much, Loes and Sebastian, for joining me today. That was a really, really great discussion, and I'm really glad that you were able to join me.
Thank you also from my side, Klara, and to everyone who was here. It was really fun.
Yeah, yeah.
Thank you,
Really
Loes.
great. Thank you so
I
much,
loved it.
UNESCO team.
Yes.
Always good to be with you guys in the same space, wherever it is. So
If you
thank
could
you
send the to those of us who are registered, would you be able to send us the video recording of this? I'd like to review.
It's going to go up on YouTube. So we have a YouTube channel that we've also just started up. It's going to go there.
Lovely. If you could send the link, that would be wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, everybody.
Have a lovely evening, everyone. See you soon.
You too.
See you soon. Bye. Thank you.